it's just critical that we have real leadership, real thoughtfulness. And I feel like I can add a lot in kind of representing the folks of this district. So I decided to run because I want to advocate for everyone to have opportunities for health and success. And I think that I feel like I'm pretty well suited to be able to do that.
And I do want to touch on the Black Lives Matter movement real quick. I know you were at the protest in Charlottesville on Saturday. How do you see that movement fitting into your campaign?
It fits in as far as calling for significant and serious criminal justice reform. Because when I say criminal justice reform, a lot of times people are thinking of prisons and mass incarceration, and that's all true. But the challenges we have in our criminal justice system start with the apprehension of a crime, with policing, and they run all the way through the reentry into society. So every step along the way is rife with disparities. We've got to fix that to have a really functioning economy, to have really functioning communities, and now is the time to do it. And so I think from a Black Lives Matter standpoint, it's sad that after all of these years we're still debating that idea. I think some of the conversation I'm seeing more online this time around, because this racial trauma happens to us every few weeks or months, but this time around I see more widespread acceptance of the notion that Black Lives Matter, but that's not enough, right? We have to go beyond hashtags, beyond slogans, and find real solutions. Things that I think about are, how do we change local law enforcement, and then also just changing the criminal code so that when law enforcement officials commit murder, they can be appropriately prosecuted. You're never going to deter it if people have immunity from that sort of thing. Because I say it all the time, my dad was in law enforcement. He worked for the DEA for 30 years. I have a deep respect for law enforcement officials, but also as a Black man, I've been unfairly pulled over by the police. I had a gun pulled on me when I was 16 years old by an officer. And I think those experiences, they shape you and they change your experience. And I would be lying if I didn't say that I have a level of fear sometimes when I have encounters with law enforcement because of what's going on in our society. That shouldn't be the case. And we have to redesign it so that it's not.
And assuming Denver Riggleman is the nominee, why are you the candidate that can beat him?
I think if Denver Riggleman is the nominee, I actually think I'm the best poised candidate to beat him, because he won in part because he ran as a moderate last time. He ran saying that he was going to protect the Affordable Care Act and build upon it. I would beg to differ. When it comes to healthcare, he's voted against protecting patients with pre-existing conditions. He's voted against reducing the cost of prescription drugs. To be quite frank, I think that the doctor in me knows that on healthcare, we can do a lot better. And the lawyer in me knows I can prosecute his voting record pretty effectively. It's not a strong record on healthcare, and that's the number one issue to voters. And so when it comes down to healthcare being the number one issue both for Democrats and for independent voters in this area, it's no contest. I think that we'll win the argument on issues if Congressman Riggleman is the nominee.
And what is your healthcare plan?
So I think that everybody should have access to care. It's this idea of universal health coverage. And what that means is that everyone should have access to the care that they need of sufficient quantity to be effective, and that access to care, actually taking advantage of that care, shouldn't cause any financial harm. So that's kind of the core principle that's grounding the idea. And some folks will say, oh, public option. Everybody's saying public option. I'm a little bit different, because actually what I'm advocating for, I designed myself in a lot of ways. I think that the first thing for me is, for that public option to work, it has to operate in a broader context. So I start with saying, in this pandemic where 40 million people have lost their jobs, now is the time for us to break that connection between employment and health insurance. If you put that in the context of a public option, they can choose a public plan that works for them. Or if they feel like a private plan serves them and their family better, they'll choose that. And I think that, we designed this public plan in a way that has a broad range of services, that's accessible, that gives you access to all the different providers. It can be really effective. And just like I rattled that off, and you can see me getting really excited about healthcare, that's an area where I have deep expertise. And so I'm not going to Congress just to cast a vote in favor of somebody else's plan. I'm going to help shape that plan. And here in Charlottesville in particular, we had the highest health insurance premiums in the country. So it's a huge issue, and I think I can really lead on that.
And how do you see the pandemic relating to healthcare, things like testing, vaccines?
It's more than testing and vaccines. That's a huge part of it, of course. But I'll start by just the impact it's had on our costs in healthcare. The reality is that health systems across the country are hurting. And if you look at the stimulus packages that have been put together in Congress, they're all looking to make hospitals and healthcare providers whole. how to protect our rural hospitals. And that's a huge issue in a district like the Fifth. Rural hospitals are the only access to care that a lot of individuals have. And so making sure that those are protected when they were under deep threat with this pandemic. And in terms of testing and vaccines and treatment, that's all critical stuff. I think that on the testing front, you have to have the public health preparedness to scale that up. That's something where we missed the mark. On the vaccine side, one thing I want to always point out is that it has to be distributed equitably, right? Because if it's anything like the testing played out with people who had access, who had resources, getting access to testing first. Doing the same thing with vaccines would be entirely unethical. We have to find a better way to administer that, and that's going to be a large government program. And so all these things, again, require a lot of expertise, a lot of leadership, and some of it's going to play out at the state level. But as far as Congress goes, I think that I could bring a lot of leadership to this.
So one of the hot topic issues in Charlottesville specifically is affordable housing, and I noticed you have a plan on that in your website. Could you talk about how your plan is going to curb the housing crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this affordable housing crisis plays out at multiple levels. So I love the advocacy we have here locally, and we have just some amazing individuals who are help leading that charge. But I think that in addition to what's happening locally, you need state and federal interventions as well. So for affordable housing here, one of the big challenges and one part of the reason why we have such a shortage of affordable housing here is the legacy of residential segregation, of racism, of redlining. And the way that plays out now is through what we call exclusionary zoning. And so from a federal standpoint, we can work to eliminate exclusionary zoning across all of our states, all of our localities. That's just not the way that we should be designing communities. The next piece is the homeownership gap. And I think that's a huge role for Congress to play as well. The idea of building wealth through homeownership is something that we've seen over time. And I think that there's a lot that we can do to get folks opportunities to buy homes, whether that's more favorable rates, whether that's really incentivizing being a first-time home buyer and giving folks the resources to make sure that they can sustain that property. I think we can do much better from a federal standpoint. And yes, that's the executive branch, that's a federal agency, but as Congress, we are in charge of the appropriations. We can really draft legislation that guides the direction of those things. And that's something I've seen for years. I used to work in doing health equity work in public housing when I was in New York City with the Office of Health Equity. So I've got some experience in this space. It's not just public housing, but we do have to make sure that we've got more affordable housing. And that's a huge issue here in Charlottesville.